Hi, folks. How are things? Are we having a good end of SREcon? Okay, cool. Y'all don't really want to hear from me, but hi, I'm Maggie Johnson-Pint, and I have a seed stage startup that isn't as cool as these people's companies yet. I'm super excited to be here. First thing I'll do is I will just have these two folks introduce themselves.
Is it working? Woo! It is. Hi, I am Charity Majors, co-founder and CTO of Honeycomb.io, which is the OG observability company.
David Cramer, similar thing, also .io, Sentry. The .com's owned by somebody with much more money than us. We kind of do the other side of the spectrum, I think, from Honeycomb, is what I would say. We'll talk about that.
Yeah, totally. So to kick this off, I just want to mention, first of all, these two people are super cool for being up in this stage because you could construe their software to be competitive, and they're here anyways. And I just say, as a founder, that's unbelievably brave. So thank you. One thing I want to point out, Stanza does this user interface-aware traffic management thing, which I won't get too far into. But to do that, we have to plumb telemetry from the client into the infrastructure, and we ride on the W3C baggage. And so I talked to a lot of devs, both who are client devs, like JavaScript devs, and to backend devs. And it's been really interesting over building out our product story that there's this high energy love for both of these products, kind of coming from two different sides. So in this audience here in SRE land, man, do people love Honeycomb. Can I see who the Honeycomb users are? I'm sure you're out there. Okay, yep.
Few but mighty.
Mighty.
A lot of opportunity in this.
That's right.
And then when you go over into, my background's as a JS dev, when you go into the client devs, they are super into Sentry. And so it's interesting to see two companies that both are doing distributed trace sort of coming from these different directions and sort of I need you both because I need you to forward the baggage.
I like that W3C baggage. I've never heard a better term for it.
Yep. But anyways, it's really interesting to bring these two folks together to kind of talk about distributed trace. I do want to check Sentry users. We got those out there? We got to have some of you too, right? Yep. And then how many of you have Sentry on the client team, but you as an SRE don't use it, the client team uses it? Yeah, we got at least one. Yep. Okay. And then a couple other questions just so that we can, I think, ask good questions, give good answers. Who here is super familiar with distributed trace and expert? You're awesome. You know everything about it. Liz is. I agree. No, really, who here does it a lot? There's got to be some people here who do it a lot. Okay. A few of you. Okay. And who's pretty darn new to this space? You don't know a lot about distributed tracing. Okay. So we're trending more towards new. That's good to know. All right. And then one other thing I'm just plain curious about, who here in your heart feels like you're a developer? Okay. And who here in your heart feels like you're an ops person? Oh, that's an interesting split. That was a 50-50. Who's I'm both, actually? They're coming together, aren't they?
Yes.
Okay. So we've seen all day lots of energy and lots of focus around distributed tracing. We've seen quite a few talks that touch on this. But the first thing I'm going to kick these folks off with, Charity, you go first since you're immediately next to me, is what's the purpose of distributed tracing? And why build a product for it?
The purpose of distributed tracing is, we blew up the monolith, and now we have to see where our requests are going somehow, right? You can't attach a debugger to your code anymore. It's hopping the network all over the place. So it's your job to, trace it, and thus distributed tracing is born. And I think that why build a product to address it is because I think that this is, I just think this is the most powerful. I have so much to say about this, and I'll hold back because it's just the introductory question. But I think that it's sorry. The harder I tell myself not to swear, the more I do. It's the most incredibly powerful thing that people can arm themselves with right now when it comes to understanding, learning, and operating software.
This is a tricky question because I'm not entirely in agreement that it's useful. I think tracing exists because everybody thought microservices were a good idea, and now we're just here getting out the shovels and continuing to dig. I think that's different from open telemetry and things, of course. I think it has some value, and especially at bigger organizations that are more complicated. It should have very little value at small orgs that should not be complicated, which I think is the dilemma of the world right now.
Oh man, I couldn't disagree more. The amazing thing about microservices is that it introduced us to a world where distributed tracing is needed, but some of the most passionate, dedicated users of tracing today actually use monoliths, and it's because the tooling is so much better at signaling and tracing intent than any strace-like tool. Sorry, Maggie.
No, you can keep, like, David, do you have a...
I mean, we don't really need tracing in our monolith. Like, we just monkey patch a bunch of things and we know where all the calls are.
Doesn't that sound like a great answer?
It works super well. I actually think the trace is useful. I think the distributed part has less value in most systems. Like, I actually don't need to connect services most of the time, but I do need to see the span waterfall within a service.
Absolutely. What's the difference between a distributed trace and a trace?
It's a fair question. I don't know. Same thing.
Okay.
Okay, we'll just keep this going. I'll throw this one at you. Is open telemetry good?
You want like a binary answer?
No. Give me your full.
You know, I think you've all been conned by the cloud vendors. I don't need there's a new spec for logs. Don't logs have a spec that's existed for like 30 years or something? Open tracing versus open telemetry. I'm not a huge fan of open telemetry. Open tracing, I think, is good for a lot of reasons, like the standardization of the spec and instrumentation, portability, whatever you want to pick. But at the very least, we're all like instrumenting things. I think it has a lot of flaws at the same time. Like, I think there's traditional service boundaries that are less understood. I think the annotations are not well formed, and the cleanliness of the data is not there, which creates a lot of challenges when you're trying to create a product with a very specific purpose in mind. A good example is like, we're SREs, right? Not me, you all. You have a database. You're familiar with database monitoring tools like, I don't know what the MySQL ones are, but PG Badger, PG Analyze, all these things, right? They spit out awesome information about your database. Hypothetically, you should be able to get a lot of that from spans, from OpenTelemetry data. Practically speaking, it's very dirty data that is very hard to curate in that way. And so I think the intent is good. I think the execution, we'll see what it looks like 10 years from now, but so I'm mixed feelings.
Is OpenTelemetry good? Yes. Is it young? Absolutely. But there's a reason it's the second most contributed to, most energetic project in CNCF. And that's because, 6 or 7 years, around the time we started Honeycomb, I remember just like, why is it that we are like, it feels like 20 years behind where it ought to be when it comes to logging, basic logging, just, every, you basically just start out with printfs, and then as your organization grows up, we all just start reinventing the wheel. There's nothing that's like cross-platform, there's specific libraries for Python, but like, how is it that we don't have that yet? And the reason, because we don't, sorry, I get very excited. The fact that we don't have it is why vendors have been just taking us to the cleaners for the last many, many years. The vision of OpenTelemetry is that you instrument your software and you instrument it once. It's one thing that you have to understand. And then vendors have to bid for your money by competing in terms of the value that they're giving you and the services that they provide and how easy they make it to understand your code. One of the biggest things that vendors have going for them right now is vendor lock-in. Who wants to re-instrument their code? No matter how unhappy you are with your vendor, you don't want to like spend the quarter or whatever it would take you to like rip and replace because the increase in value is difficult to prove or negligible. That sucks. We're so overdue for something like OpenTelemetry. I'm not going to argue that it's the greatest piece of software in the world, but the pace at which it is accelerating is rapid, and the value that we all stand to gain from it is vast.
I agree. I think actually, here's a good analogy because I was watching the Grafana thing. And the pitch was it should be an agent, which is kind of the opposite of OpenTelemetry, right? That's still, like, hypothetically, that's login, or it's auto-instrumented, which honestly, if it's auto-instrumented, whatever. Like, yeah, you have to redo metrics kind of things. But I think if you get beyond login is like, okay, login should just be a known quantity at this point in life as our metrics. I think a good example is, like, at some point, like probably many of you, we all switched to Datadog and aren't happy about how much we pay, but we kept using StatsD. Because why would we switch to a different way of sending stats? It doesn't really matter. So some of these problems I feel like were already, maybe not fully solved, but they were fine, you know? Tracing obviously way different, it didn't really exist, but like logs and metrics were never a problem, I guess, from my angle, so.
Well, I guess that explains it.
So how, I mean, this is a fair call out though, like how is tracing different than logs? What's the meaningful difference here?
The meaningful, well, I mean, from a technical perspective, of course, you've got the IDs that you're propagating through the stack. And it allows you to really overlay your intent. This is important. This is going to be important. This is definitely going to be important. I'm going to want to be able to visualize this in the future.
I always think of logs because Sentry tries very hard to not do logs.
Logs suck. Logs should die.
I remember having this conversation with somebody at Slack a long time ago. I'm like, you guys should use Sentry. And the guy is just like, will my developers fix the bugs? I'm like, I don't know. It's unrelated. But he was stuck on old style. He's like, well, I have logs. I have Kibana or whatever at the time. And I'm like, it's not the same thing, though. It's just like freeform stuff. And now what I try to articulate is like when somebody's like, why would I need logs? Especially like an early stage company. I'm like, well, you probably don't need them at all. It's like logs are for mostly compliance and security, in all honesty. Like if you need logs to debug anything, I feel like there are infinitely better ways you could be solving problems. Whether it's through something like tracing or, you know, Sentry does the errors side of things. There's lots of better solutions that are not weird freeform data that doesn't have much meaning.
Yeah, logs are trash. And that whole line that vendors have been selling about how you never want to drop a log line that's just to pad their budgets. Like, you can drop all kinds of log lines and you'll be fine.
So I just want to put a pin in this one that I learned from David Cramer like a year ago now, that all good discussions start with finding something you mutually hate. And you're here, so congratulations. All right. Let's see. By the way, I'm going to go back. I am monitoring like the questions in the chat. Oh, great. I've got one in here labeled troll question. Okay. This is a good one. Okay. One definition of incident is a situation that doesn't match the expectations of an expert. How does this play into your products as people use it to understand their systems?
Well, so I don't really think of Honeycomb as a tool that you use just an incident response. I mean, that's the tip of the iceberg. Honeycomb is a tool that you use for understanding your software from when you begin to write it, as you're shipping new stuff out. Like, you should be looking at it and constantly asking yourself, is this change I made, is it behaving as I intended it to? Does anything else look weird? The thing that I do like about that definition, so I would say that's kind of orthogonal to incident management, but the thing I do like about that is because after working on this problem for so long, it is striking just how much of debugging comes down to, here's the thing I care about, how is it different? Like, over and over, how many different ways is it different? Like, the bubble up tool that we have is basically just a way to collapse the iteration of, you know, if you've got a spike in your logs or your events or whatever, and you're like, okay, you know, maybe you have 300 different attributes on these arbitrarily wide structured data blobs. You can't go like, is it the endpoint? No. Is it the latency? No. Like, you don't have time to do that, right? So BubbleUp just like computes for all the dimensions inside the thing that you said you care about and outside, and then diffs them and sorts them. And so if it's like, you know, if you're debugging this by hand and you know the system well, you might guess 2 or 3 of them, but you probably aren't going to guess like 30 of them. Yeah, that's all I got. I think that it's remarkable how much of debugging just comes down to that one small workflow.
Yeah. For me, an incident is something that I have to deal with when I have other things to do. I don't really care much about academics. I'd also say Sentry doesn't really deal in incident management either. Like, we're generally speaking operating much higher level. It doesn't mean we're not part of it. Like, usually when there's an incident, things are throwing errors or some other characteristics. But we try not to compete with these big, complicated vendors like ServiceNow or Atlassian, and ticket tracking. So I don't know. I think it's one of those things. It's an inevitability, but it's when the system's doing something that you don't want it to be doing. Mostly straightforward.
All right, walking back. Actually, so you know what I think we should talk about going back into tracing. First question, what are the biggest opportunities in the OpenTelemetry standard? Like, what are the places that we should be investing our time and energy to improve?
Not being an expert, I could give you a laundry list of problems I have with it, but I'm actually surprised when some of the things do what I would want them to do, because that's usually not how technology works these days. I think for me, the biggest thing is like naming conventions need to be enforced everywhere. You need to be able to classify things very coherently and cluster the data. That's a big problem. I also am not convinced the implementation is functional for client runtimes, JavaScript, mobile apps, et cetera. We're facing this right now, and that's like kind of where I say we come from the opposite end of the spectrum. We are heavily focused starting from the UI down, and I'm sure half of you probably have no idea how the JavaScript apps work, but they're becoming a nightmare for everybody to deal with. And I think OTel is extremely weak there. And I think it's mostly because the people building it maybe aren't familiar with those spaces. They don't focus on that. But it is a very serious challenge for us. Whereas Java, cool, like everybody uses Java. We don't really care. It's instrumented super well, So I think if people would focus on the majority, which is JavaScript in the world right now, that is like a super critical investment that must be made. And if you can't do that, OTel will fail.
Number one, I think that there's still a lot to be done just focusing on, the building blocks, the robust building blocks on which everything else can be built. I hope we don't get too distracted before we get good, solid auto instrumentation for those, because, it's super important if it's going to live up to its promise that those be done well, that they truly be interoperable, et cetera. I also think that instrumentation for testing is super important. Being able to run a collector during test runs and gather information before you've put it in production be super valuable. But above all, I think it's just the network effects of having more and more people using it, having the errors be Googleable, being able to share wisdom, being able to use it from job to job. This is the last best rewrite of your telemetry that you will ever have to do. So find some time in your in your roadmap to do it now.
Okay, I'm into a horrible product manager thing. When people are using tracing in test runs, what are they looking at? Because you won't necessarily get repeatable performance data from a test run.
Oh, it's not for performance data at all. It's for looking at the paths.
Okay. So
Looking at paths and just telling is it doing what I expected it to do? Does anything else look weird? There's a lot that you can tell from, don't get me wrong, production is where it's at. But just in terms of what's it calling and when and where, there's a lot of really subtle behaviors that you can track down there.
Yeah, I'd agree. It's useful for actually you can, to be fair, you can actually diagnose a lot of performance problems without real load.
Also true.
And so now I'm not going to say we have products that do that well, because those are hard problems to diagnose, but I think the debuggability, and I also think there is something to be said. A lot of people actually do benchmarking in CI worlds, right? Because some people have mission critical performance applications where it needs to stay fast. And so I think in those worlds, that's the dream, right? Synthetic whatever magic in CI, so none of your users experience the pain. We'll never get there, but I think the instrumentation is good all over the place.
Oh man, I don't have my shirt. My test and prod or live a lie. Sorry. Seems relevant.
Okay, so here's one from the chat that I actually really love. Any plans to use distributed tracing for digital experience monitoring, like ROM or session replays?
Ha! Funny you should ask. I have no comment at this time. One thing that I would like to point out, though, is because I don't know if there's a graceful question, so I'm just going to interject this. It was so sad, when Maggie was asking how many people here are experts in tracing, and nobody raised their hands, and then she's like, how many people are pretty good at it? And one person raised their hand. This is one of the original sins of distributed tracing, is that every place I know that's put a lot of energy into rolling it out in production, months, years later, they're still one person who knows how to use it, or at best maybe one team. And when engineers want to trace something, it's a last resort, and they go to that one person or that one team to help them do it. It's never become like a utility knife that people embed into their daily work. And I think that it's understandable. Part of it is that it has an entirely different source of truth than, say, if you're using metrics or logs, which is, and this is not a Honeycomb woo-woo thing, but like that's why we embedded it into, it's the same source of truth, right? If you've got a spike in your dashboard, you slice and dice, you find the event, then you trace it, and you can go up and down. It's got to get easier to use, and it's got to get integrated into our other tools in order for it to be relevant enough and easy to use. But until we get that down, like this is just untenable. It's not possible to have a good tracing experience when nobody can understand it and nobody uses it.
I'll answer the RUM thing, but on that same point, I mean, you've probably all worked with profiling data, hopefully, at some point. That's the extreme version of tracing, which is even harder to use, and I think that's actually a flaw right now with the technology. It's like, it's very hard to consume. And we have the same thing, like, even dog fooding our products internally. It's like, nobody knows how to use these systems. Nobody knows how to use profiling data, so we've like decided to use it for other things. It's like, they're too complicated. The only solution is to make products make them easier, in my opinion. On RUM and session replay, I don't think RUM is a real thing. It's like analytics or something. I don't even know what it's supposed to be to be honest. Like,
it's metrics that knows about sessions.
It's a confusing product for me. And now you have companies calling RUM different things in the future. Like Datadog calls RUM something completely different than New Relic. And anyway, so RUM I have a pet peeve with. They're all just APM products. It's all the same stuff. Session replay. I mean, we have a session replay product. I'm very biased. We only build for developers at the end of the day. And so if you're trying to like do analytics stuff, there's better products for that. There's other categories. They're big businesses, big companies, even if the tech kind of looks the same. And so we avoid it like as much as possible.
Yeah, I think anytime you're like, okay, I've got these 5 different products to understand my software systems, I'm going to add a 6th and a 7th. You're paying to store that data every single time, and if it's not connected to the other tools, it's really very low marginal benefit that you're getting back from it.
All right. Let's see. First of all, I need to give my co-founder crap for putting jokes in the thread that I now have to read around. Stop it.
What are the jokes?
I don't even know. But Niall started it. Oh, the only standard for logs he's aware of is array of char. Anyways. Okay, this is a really good question. Distributed tracing helps to trace transactions, but how do we find the reasons for the failures without logs, and how do you monitor without alerts or metrics?
Have you seen Honeycomb? Like, we use arbitrarily wide structured data blobs. That's the source of truth, which is, you could call them canonical logs. I don't like to call them logs because the assumptions are like the mirror image of what you assume with logs. We use arbitrarily wide structured data blobs. And you can derive metrics from these blobs. You can derive logs from them. You can't go in the opposite direction. So, you've got your dashboard. You've got a spike in it. It looks just like a metrics dashboard. You click on it. You've got your events. You click on one, you trace it. Like, it couldn't be easier.
Yeah, I agree. Like my pet peeve, and this OTel, another bone to pick. I do not like that metrics are abstracted from traces. They should not
Bullshit.
be separate entities.
They should never be separate.
Yeah, this is. I'm like, we don't need another stats_d implementation. It's the same thing. So like, 100%. In an ideal world, everything is some kind of structured event, whatever you want to call it, structured data. You can extract, compute metrics from it. Makes sense. It's how we all reason about everything. That's just life. I think errors, I don't know. Like, you can obviously spot errors in this data. I think crash handling is a known quantity thing that's existed for, I don't know how long software existed, but that long. And it is a different problem to some degree. It's not a few debug statements. It's a giant blob of data that you need collected whenever the incident occurs, right? So.
Yeah, metrics were a very cutting-edge data type back in 1973 when they were invented. Like, because hardware was so expensive. They were just like, what is the least amount of data that we can gather and store on our 8-bit ran, whatever. And it's like a number, a single number. That's all a metric is a single number with some tags appended. You can do so little with it, and it's so expensive. All of those custom metrics that you have to create shouldn't exist. Metrics should be derived from events and never used other than that.
I like the passion.
Sorry.
Derived metric. No, I feel you. Okay, I want to go back to one that had a ton of upvotes in here, and it is a good one. What's the role of eBPF in distributed observability? How do we, as an industry, stand to gain from eBPF instrumenting the kernel?
I have no damn clue. Above my pay grade.
I don't think it has anything to do with distributed tracing, but it could have something interesting to do with tracing. I think that, we think it has a lot of potential to be an actual cross-platform auto-instrumentation for compiled languages that don't have, the VM.
Is eBPF, is it basically just like kernel, give me the TLDR for, I'm a dum-dum.
It's like /proc that you can do stuff with.
Okay, can we use distributed trace if we have a monolithic application, but we're communicating with different applications over the network?
Can and should.
I think you can use traces everywhere.
Everywhere.
Do you have any strategies for folks who are in that situation for how you would instrument?
Obviously, anytime you hop the network, you should, or anytime you do an HTTP call, this is what we do with auto instrumentation. We wrap the HTTP calls. We store how long did it take? What was the call? What was the return code? Do the same for databases, right? Anytime you're calling out to another service, or anytime that you're saving something super important, ooh, I'm making a payment. Well, you're probably calling across the network then. But this is why we say that it's it's distributed, is because even if you don't have multiple microservices, and I agree they're pretty overdone, you're still calling over the network, and that border between your service and the data storage layers and the other services and the web is generally where you need to understand, or you need to put it a breakpoint effectively.
Yeah, I agree. It's like any operation that adds latency, which is always network or disk. You wrap all those calls. There's usually not that many. Most of the auto instrumentation does it. What I think is interesting, so I'm sure half of you are competitors and you'll try to steal this. Good luck, but one of the big gaps in tracing is instrumentation, right? If the auto instrumentation isn't great, you have to go add all of it. And the problem is, it's just like all monitoring. You have to go add it, and then it will exist later, right? It doesn't exist when you're debugging. So one thing we're trying to do, and I don't know how everybody else thinks about this, we're trying to actually inject profiling to fill in gaps in span trees, just because we have effectively continuous profiling that runs, which I feel like there's a middle ground there that helps bring that clarity to things that you otherwise might not worry about.
Yeah.
But I think, honestly, you get 95% of the value from network file boundaries. So
this is similar to what we're looking at doing with eBPF. Is basically, it's so much easier to take away than it is to inject. So if you just generate a bunch of stuff that might be useful, and then you statistically analyze it and blah, 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 and then you let people go, that's not interesting, you might be able to get someplace. Because I agree, instrumenting for traces is a hurdle.
So I want to kind of go back to a point. There's been a couple questions about clients. I know this is a big space, but there's a question in the chat here. I'm trying to find it again that basically says, when you instrument the client, you add size, and how do we alleviate that concern? But I think in general, I think we agree that there's kind of a gap on the client side right now in distributed trace, or do you not feel that way? Let's talk about it. Let's talk about clients.
What's a client?
I think in this case the intent is the browser or your phone.
Oh yeah, there's a gap there.
Yeah, can we talk about what do we got to do to fix that?
This is really out of my wheelhouse.
Everything's bad. I don't know what to tell you. JavaScript's a nightmare.
It's all bad.
Yes, size of payload is a big problem. People complain to us every single day. You have no idea how much over-engineering goes into maintaining a small bundle. It's the worst problem in the world. And they've got some good tech to make things smaller if you don't use it, tree shaking. I don't know. It's honestly a hard problem. I will say, this stuff minifies down to almost nothing. You have an abstraction. It should be clean. It should be minimal. It's a few function calls in a network hop or something like this. It's not a lot of actually, literal lines of code. So the payload size shouldn't be that big of a deal. Obviously, if everybody has to implement their own library, it adds a lot of stuff in there. But I will also tell you, like, it is very hard for tracing to actually function in the UI because of the asynchronous nature of everything and the batching of everything. Like, React is one of the most popular libraries. You can't really trace it in a useful way. It's a big dilemma for us. We haven't solved it, and we focus a lot of time and money on it. And so I don't know. If we ever come up with a solution, I'll let you know. Maybe somebody else has some good ideas, but it's a hard problem.
It's really hard, and there are no good solutions out there. I will say that the one thing that I think is absolutely necessary for this to be useful is for it to actually connect to quote-unquote back-end tracing. You know, if we are siloed off yet again and we've like got front-end tracing cracked, but it doesn't actually go all the way through the stack to the databases and back, it's not going to be a good solution.
I would really like it to go all the way through. I mean, you heard my vested interest,
Oh, yes,
right?
yes.
But
Come on it, Maggie.
okay, I need to, in the chat, correct a slight wrong in the world. David, what's your dog's name? Coda. Okay. The chat was asked, what are the dogs' names? And 2 of them are mine, and someone hopefully answered.
I don't
their
have a dog. I'm sorry. I should have put Christine's dog. Oh, man. Missed.
Okay. Oh, here's a good question. What observability platform other than your own would you recommend?
Honeycomb. Definitely not Datadog.
We use Sentry for exceptions. We're very happy with it. I don't like to shit on competitors in public when it's being recorded.
I have no fear.
But I would say that people who are still using things like Datadog and Signal effects and stuff, you're getting very little for your money. Very little. I mean, what you're paying for is really the ability to Google name of technology plus metrics, copy-paste something, and get some graphs. And you feel very accomplished at that point. But they mean absolutely nothing. All right, and the thing is that they're not bad tools. They're good tools. And if what you do is run infrastructure, they're great for that. If what you do is write software and care about that software and your user's experience, they're not good for that at all. It's like, you know, if you're a software engineer and trying to like paw through the Datadog graphs and understand what you just did to make one of the 32 CPUs spike but not the others, and there's 4 different kinds of it. Like, you shouldn't have to know all that stuff. It's not relevant to you. We live in the days of platforms. You should be using a tool that speaks in the language of APIs and SDKs and endpoints and variables and your language, right? The language of infrastructure is not useful to you.
I actually really agree with that. And for what's worth, Datadog's not a terrible product. It's just too damn
It's
expensive.
It's a good product.
Yeah.
It's a great metrics product.
Yeah, I fully agree. But I do think this is the difference. We always talk about it. So Sentry's, the only thing we're probably good at is being very stubborn about what we do and don't do. And we drew a line in a stand a long time ago, and we said we're never doing systems monitoring, which to me is like CPU, disk, et cetera. And this is an important distinction for, especially for SRE folks to understand the changing in the world. I don't control the CPU, the memory, the disk on a desktop computer or on a mobile device or serverless or any of these newfangled platforms. So why am I monitoring it? I can't do shit about it, right? I can fix the code. I can change the code. And that is the future. Like, and I think there's too many of these vendors. Many of you, I'm sure, in the room are, unfortunately, it's a struggle, I'm sure, are stuck in the past. And it's hard to adapt like this old style thinking of logs and metrics to, none of that really works when things are running on a device or a machine I don't control, you know?
And those of us who do speak the language of low-level like systems and stuff, we need to break ourselves with a habit. Just because we can like translate the software into this CPU spiking or this type of RAM growing, doesn't mean it's useful or relevant. And if you're using a like multi-tenant system, then you probably aren't getting the true information anyway. So like we all need to be looking at our system, unless you are literally running, say, DigitalOcean, AWS, somebody who does infrastructure for a product, you need to be looking at the world through the lens of your software.
I love it. I agree with them for what it's worth. Okay, so this is a good question. Sorry, I'm popping back in the chat. We've mentioned a lot of like barriers to entry to distributed trace. It's hard, and then sort of one team gets good at it, or it only gets used in specific cases. How do the question specifically here is, how do you justify the lift to replace the existing observability stack with trace? But I think I'd also like to hear about just strategies for organizations to make that kind of shift. Like how do
Yeah, sure. I mean, ripping and replacing is one of the most miserable things that a person can do. So you usually don't want to do it unless you've hit some forcing function, right? And for a lot of people, shifting to Kubernetes is kind of the forcing function that makes them sort of reevaluate all their life choices. But if you have just kind of run into a state where like you're spending a fortune on custom metrics and you just can't really understand your software, you know, the way I think of this is as a headlamp, right? You deploy the instrumentation, you know, the basics, auto instrumentation, whatever you've got. I'm using Honeycomb as an example, right? You roll it out, and then you instrument as you debug, right? You get paid for something, instrument it. It will help you debug it faster, it will help you fix it faster, and you will understand it. And if you just debug as you go, after, you know, 2 or 3 months in a pretty active system, most of the hot paths are going to be, you know, well instrumented, and you're going to be picking up speed. And that's how you gain the political capital to invest the like elbow grease to get it over the hill.
Yeah, I think the conversations we hear from our customers, it's usually money driven. Now, that's not necessarily they're going to switch to open tracing or anything like that, or open telemetry, sorry. But it is like a forcing function for evaluating what they need to do in the future. And if they're like, oh, this APM vendor's $10 million a year, oh, I could use this other vendor, but I got to do some work and it'll cost me $4 million a year. $6 million is a lot of money, right? You can invest, you know, a few engineers, re-implement a bunch of monitoring, and you're good to go. And I think especially, there's a complexity here because there's like the APM space, you know, higher level, it's more catered to developers, and then there's like the lower level system space. And APM is much easier to reason about because APM was always primarily auto instrumentation. And that is almost plug and play. You might have a different product experience or something, and all the APM vendors are having to adapt, and they're like, oh shit, we have to support open telemetry and whatnot, and traces, right? And so that's good for everybody. Not always good for the big vendors. Obviously, they've had to become more price competitive, which is good for us. But that's like what I've seen as the big forcing function is just the price of monitoring servers is really, really high for an unclear reason these days.
That's true. I think the reason is because they can. Because for a long time, they could.
These two missed the capitalism lesson from birth, clearly.
Our seed stage pitch was, if we can't make money, nobody will. It's working out.
Okay, I'm going back through the chat. You all are like very busy in the chat, and then I have to like try to keep up here. There was a question. I will have to go find it. It was interesting. But okay, here we go. Do you think you can implement self-healing AI ops based on tracing?
Now that's a troll.
I don't believe in AI yet, so no.
I believe in AI, but not AI ops. Just AI ops doesn't need to exist. Every single example I have seen of somebody trying to point AI ops at something, it shouldn't have existed in the first place, and it just should have been killed.
I'm still not sure what AI ops is. I thought it was just marketing.
It definitely is a give me lots of money kind of flag, but it's bullshit. Like training on, the most egregious one I saw was, I'm not going to name the vendor because I can't remember their name, but they were like, if you are getting flooded with emails about alerts going off, we will point our AI ops at the stream and tell you which ones to care about. Where do you even start? Like, just delete them all and the problem goes away.
I'm sure there's like half a dozen people in here right now trying to feed alerts into ChatGPT and see if it helps them.
Oh, if you're doing that, ask it to return the results in the form of a limerick. Reliably works.
Yeah, no, I think it's good. I think it's good. All right. Okay. This one was from a few minutes ago, and I found in the upvotes. Currently, distributed trace seems synonymous with observability. Is there ever going to be a point where people call observability something different or beyond traces?
I don't fucking care. But the reason... The reason I think that tracing is becoming synonymous with observability is actually a really good reason. Because if you, some of you may have read some of my rants on the topic of what observability is and isn't. And I think it really, if you want to be, if it's about unknown unknowns, not known unknowns, but unknown unknowns, and being able to ask any question, understand any inner state of the system without having to ship new custom code to handle that, which implied you had to know about it before you could know about it, right? You have to have these arbitrarily wide structured data blobs. You have to deal in events. You have to have high cardinality. You have to have high dimensionality and all this stuff. And what's an extremely wide event with a span ID? Well, it's just a trace, right? Like events are spans, are events, are spans. They really are so close to being the same thing that they can be the same thing. And I guarantee you're going to see more vendors out there that are shipping this model because it's just the right answer. It's just the right thing to do. It takes a while to build a storage engine, but it's the right thing to do. Yeah, I think that's partly why I believe in tracing so strongly, is because everything you need to understand your systems is also traceable.
Yeah, I don't have a horse in the terminology race either.
Good. I'm glad that we aren't going to bike shed terms today. This was awesome. I think the clock just told us that we can't do any more questions. So, like, if I didn't get to you, I'm sorry, and I love you. And I think we're all around after this, and everybody probably wants to go to a happy hour, right?
Woo!
Yeah, thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you both for being here.
Thanks, Maggie.
Thanks, everybody.